In this video, I am going to talk about the biography of Arthur Miller, 1915 to 2005. Arthur Miller was an American playwright, essayist and screenwriter in the 20th century American theater. Among his most popular plays are All My Son, 1947, Death of a Salesman, 1949, The Crucible, 1953, and A View from the Bridge, 1955. Arthur Miller was born in New York in 1915 to Jewish parents whose fathers had both come to America from the same village in Poland. As a child, he lived in Harlem, which was then a fairly prosperous part of New York, where his father had built up a successful business in the garment trade. However, as he tells us in his autobiography, Timmy Benz, 1987, he felt he had absorbed 2,000 years of European history, of which unbeknown to me, I had become a part, and that he had already been programmed to choose something other than pride in his origins. Timmy Benz, p.24. Applying for a library card at the age of 6 involved him in an interrogation about himself which made him conscious of belonging to a minority, whose institutions and customs seemed strange to him. Although it is written with hindsight and with the developed skills of a master dramatist, Timmy Benz suggests that, even as a young boy, Miller was intensely aware of the differences between individual members of his family, and that he saw these differences as indications of types which were repeated generation after generation in the history of human relationships within the family. His childhood was full of stories in which the parts were played by his family and friends. These stories, as he tells them, had form. They expressed the character of those who took part in them, and it was their character which determined their fate. It may be that here we see the hand of the dramatist reworking his memories according to the habits of his later stage practice. On the other hand, we may observe in these childhood perceptions unconscious ways of seeing the world which were later to shape the fictional worlds of his plays. When Arthur Miller was in his early teens, the New York stock market crashed and there followed the years of the Depression which affected many businessmen, including his father. The family had to move to Brooklyn, where Miller attended the local high school. The difficulties which they faced not only brought financial hardship but also damaged his father's reputation within the family. The impatience which Miller's mother felt for her husband's inability to surmount his financial problems shaded into a certain sneering contempt for him that filtered through her voice. Timmy Benz, p.112. Arthur Miller's mother's marriage had been arranged for her by her father. She had been a distinguished student at school and was an avid reader. His father was formally less well educated, but he had a keen interest in the theater, and Miller came to respect his judgment about what he had seen. In Timmy Benz, Miller describes the ambivalence of the family's feelings about his father. On the one hand, he was respected for his gentleness, on the other, he was almost despised for his lack of education and for his failure as a provider. On leaving school, Miller felt under pressure to make money. He worked for a time in a warehouse which stored parts for cars, where he learned much about the hardship of the lives of working people, and where he had his first experience of institutionalized anti-Semitism. He also made an attempt to become a singer. By this time, he had heard of Marxism and had been introduced to the concept of world revolution. Drawn to the idea of comradeship rather than competition, Miller embraced a form of rational humanism, a viewpoint based on the belief that human destiny is determined by men and women themselves, rather than by any form of deity, and that conflicts can be resolved by intelligent argument and compassion. This outlook was opposed to the traditions of his family, and looked forward to building a new society out of the ruins of capitalism that Miller felt had failed his generation. To be interested in communism in the 1930s, and to look optimistically to the Soviet Union as a model, seemed to Miller later to have been a rational response to his family's experience of sudden financial failure, even if events would show that he had been misled by his naivety. In 1934 he enrolled as a student at the University of Michigan, which at the time had a reputation for liberal attitudes. There he intended to study journalism, though he later switched to English. While he was a student, some of his plays won awards, including a prize given by the Theatre Guild in New York for student writers. In 1938 he graduated from university and spent a brief period working for the Federal Theatre Project, a welfare department organization established to encourage playwrights, which he preferred to the bondage of writing scripts for Hollywood. In 1940 he married Mary Slattery, a Catholic girl whom he had known at university. They lived in Brooklyn, a borough of New York on the southwest end of Long Island. Little more than a week after their marriage, Miller went to work on the freighter because he wanted to get experience of life at sea, and also because he wanted to affirm that, although he was now married, he had not lost his freedom to explore the world. He talks of deep doubts within himself at this time and of his divided desire for settled order and a lust for experience that sent him off. Timmy Benz, page 70. He and his wife felt that they were consciously discarding the bonds of their religions and placing their faith in the humanist views Miller had earlier championed, whose best social exemplification, so they believed, was the Soviet Union. For a time, he wrote radio plays, but he gave them up to work for nearly 2 years in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. In 1943 he to make a screenplay based on a collection of newspaper columns by a popular war reporter. His first Broadway play, The Man Who Had All the Luck, which he began writing in 1941, was a failure when it was performed in 1944. Afterwards, Miller wrote that he thought the play contained the seeds of much of his later work. He had simply failed to develop adequately the relationship between father and sons and the conflicts between them. This theme was much more successfully explored in All My Sons, which was produced in 1947. In this play the conflict between son and father serves to demonstrate their duty to care for one another. The father commits suicide when he finally acknowledges his responsibility for the death of one of his sons. He also implicitly acknowledges a responsibility which transcends the family circle. The dead son stands for all the young men who have died because of the willingness of the older generation to profit from war. It is characteristic that Miller's response to the success of his play was to apply to the New York State Employment Service for any job available. Timmy Benz, 138. So intense was his fear of losing contact with the people about whom he was writing and his sense of guilt at his success. It is also characteristic of him to confess that in the few days he then spent working in a box factory he found loneliness rather than comradeship. Miller tells us in Timmy Benz that in the years that followed All My Sons he began to explore the life of the waterfront in Red Hook, Brooklyn. He became interested in the lives of the longshoremen, the men who loaded and unloaded the ships, who led a precarious existence, knowing their jobs from day to day relied on the whims of unions and employers. In particular, he studied the disappearance of a longshoreman who had tried to challenge what he perceived as the corrupt leadership of the International Longshoremen's Association. Miller became involved in the political ambitions of one of the opponents of the union bosses, who hoped to increase his popularity among the Italian immigrant workers of Brooklyn by visiting their families in Sicily. Consequently, Miller embarked on a journey to Europe in the aftermath of the Second World War, where he became aware of the complexities of America's involvement in the reconstruction of nations which had suffered devastation and defeat. His experience of crooked labor leaders, with their connections with the mafia, went into a screenplay, called The Hook, which was written for Columbia Pictures in 1951, but Miller refused to make his villains communists, and the film was never made. His experiences nevertheless were to prove valuable, as it was from his involvement with the problems of the longshoremen of Brooklyn that A View from the Bridge would spring. But before A View from the Bridge was written there intervened, first, Miller's major success, Death of a Salesman, 1949, an adaptation of Ibsen's An Enemy of the People, 1950, and The Crucible, 1953. The post-war years in America were a time both of increasing tension with the Soviet Union and of a growing fear that communism had become a subversive force in American society, especially in intellectual and artistic circles. The House of Representatives Un-American Activities Committee was set up to investigate the extent of alleged subversion in public life and soon became a powerful and influential voice. A conference for world peace in which Miller participated during the first production of Death of a Salesman in 1949, which was convened to oppose the growing rift between America and Russia, quickly fell foul of anti-communist sentiment in the United States. Miller himself had, by this time, begun to question the value of Marxism as a political dogma and of Russian communism as a model for civil society. He was, however, totally opposed to the growing demands for social conformity and the harassment of left-wing political sympathizers. The following year he wrote a version of Henrik Ibsen's An Enemy of the People, which was intended to uphold the right of the individual to resist the pressure to conform. According to Miller, this period of his life was one of personal re-examination, a process which influenced his first sketches for what he called an Italian tragedy. The play set out to explore the mysterious world of incestuous feelings and their denial, leading to a murder-suicide, 𝒕𝒉𝒖𝒓 325, but as the political situation in the United States became dominated by the hearings of the House Un-American Activities Committee into the past political affiliations of writers, artists, film stars and so on, Miller decided to put the play on one side and turn to consider more topical themes. Struck by the atmosphere of irrational fear and unsubstantiated accusations that prevailed in 1950s America and by the parallel between the proceedings of the committee and accusations of witchcraft which had been leveled against some of the inhabitants of Salem, Massachusetts, in 1692, he set to work on a new play, The Crucible. At the time of its first production in 1953 it was a critical but not a commercial success. It was not until later that it was performed worldwide to popular acclaim. In 𝒕𝒉𝒖𝒓 Miller notes that its popularity often seems tied to the political situation prevailing in the particular country it is performed. It is either a warning of tyranny on the way or a reminder of tyranny just past. p. 348. Miller's opposition to the drive for conformity in his own country earned him considerable official displeasure, which included the withdrawal of his right to travel abroad. In 1956 he was himself summoned before the House Un-American Activities Committee, but he refused to name those with whom he had associated at left-wing meetings in the 1930s, believing that while his views at that time might have been misguided, they had not been treacherous. As a result of his refusal to cooperate, he was fined and given a suspended sentence for contempt of Congress, although the conviction was later quashed by the Supreme Court. When Miller was in Hollywood in 1951, working on his screenplay about the Brooklyn waterfront, he met Marilyn Monroe, at the time a young actress at the start of her career. During the next 5 years, as his marriage disintegrated, they kept in touch, even though she married Joe DiMaggio, the baseball star, in 1954. In 1955 the one-act version of A View from the Bridge was produced in a double bill with A Memory of Two Mondays. The following year Miller divorced his first wife in order to marry Marilyn Monroe, and in the same year Miller and his new wife went to England where he was to work on a 2-act version of A View from the Bridge, while she worked with Laurence Olivier on a film called The Prince and the Showgirl. The new version of A View from the Bridge, under the direction of Peter Brook, was a success, although it ran into trouble with the theatre censor because of its allusions to homosexuality, which was then a criminal offence in Britain. Despite the almost universal adulation which she was now given by the public, Marilyn Monroe suffered from deep psychological problems which resulted in drug addiction. In 1961 she and Miller were divorced, and in 1962 Miller married 𝒔𝒐𝒻, a professional photographer. He drew on her experiences in Germany during the war in his next play, After the Fall, 1964. Unfortunately, the play was interpreted by many as a painful exposure of his life with Marilyn Monroe, who committed suicide not long before the play was produced, and the coincidence of these events led to a fall in Miller's popularity which was not easily overcome. In The Price, 1968, Miller returned to the theme of the rivalry between brothers and the search for events in the past which have determined the present. In The Creation of the World and Other Business, 1972, he used the Old Testament story of Cain and Abel to show that fratricide had been one of the earliest memories of the Jewish people. Arthur Miller has continued to write plays which have been well received, though none has achieved the success of his earlier work. His later plays include The Archbishop's Ceiling, 1977, and The American Clock, 1980. In 1965 he was elected president of International PEN, an association of writers which has done much to break down barriers between East and West and to highlight instances of the suppression of freedom of expression. In 1978 he visited China where he later directed Death of a Salesman. In 1986 he went to Russia and met Mr. Gorbachev, the new president. In 1987 he published his autobiography, Time Benz, which is both an account of his life and a political apologia. This is the end of our video. Please, do not forget to click the notification bell, like, share, comment, subscribe my channel.